painting. Thanks, guys. Okay, go ahead, Maria.
Okay, so before we start, we have keys that they've been, yes? No? Someone's keys? No? Someone's, are these yours? No, okay. So we have keys. So if you guys are missing your car keys, let me know, and then I have them for you guys. So I'm here to introduce Dr. Hop. She is actually one of our own. She graduated from UCOM in the first inaugural class. She's now a second-year psychiatry resident at a community hospital, and she has been involved with mental health for a while. She actually participated in the FIRM conference when she was a medical student, and then as a psychiatry resident, she has helped create a new role of resident wellness officer of the resident council at community, and she's worked closely with the graduate medical education team to target ways to enhance wellness in an array of residency programs. So she's been very involved with everything mental health, and she's here to talk about that. So please help me welcome Dr. Chrissy Hop.
Thanks, Maria. Hey, you guys. So this is very informal, so please feel free to stop me or ask questions or tell me I said something wrong during the whole presentation. So like Maria said, my name is Chrissy Hop. I'm actually an Indiana native. I grew up on the east side of town. I went to Warren Central, for any of you that are around the town. As you can tell from my title, shifting from self-criticism to self-compassion, I really like alliteration. I was a liberal arts grad from the University of Evansville. And then I was fortunate enough to come back to Indy to go to Marion and graduated from their inaugural class there. And like Maria said, I was involved with FIRM when it started just not too long ago as a student. So it's really an honor to come back and talk to you guys and just get to talk about wellness overall. It's really great that you guys are here because a lot of students and residents kind of blow this off because you feel like you have so many bigger things to do, right? You have a million things to study, but taking time for yourself and learning how to take time for yourself is really important. So I applaud all of you guys for being here and for sticking it out to the last lecture. I don't know that I would have done the same, so kudos. Like Maria said, wellness is really important to me. I'm a psychiatry resident. I'm in my second year. I'm upcoming chief for the residency next year. Oh, thanks. It's very exciting. And I helped create the position of resident wellness officer for our graduate medical education, which did a couple of things. I don't know if you guys have heard, especially in my year of graduating classes, everyone said they were burnout on burnout. And that we were sick of talking about it, and I don't want to hear about it again. If you're going to actually let us do something, that'd be great, but like stop talking to me about it. So we had a lot of struggles with that because we're being told from so many different places that the rate of suicide is increasing, especially in physicians. You guys all know that. So we need to talk about this, but everyone's sick of us talking about it, so what do? So one of the first things that I did was try and get buy-in from the residents, and it felt maybe a little like a bribe. But the first thing I did is I worked with a team to get everyone a half day of wellness biannually. That's right? Twice a year is biannually, I think? Yeah. So we worked to do that, and so the residents were very happy about that, as you can expect when you're really tired and not getting time off. It can be really helpful to have that. And so that's how we started developing buy-in with our residents to be more willing to come back to wellness and come back to talking with us and doing things. So that's something that's been really important to me. So, I guess I don't know how to, okay. So I'm going to talk about a few things, very simple things I'm sure you guys have heard about all day today. Hopefully this will be a nice wrap up. I don't think I'm going to talk about anything that's going to like blow your minds or that's going to be revolutionary, but hopefully this will be a good wrap up to the day and we'll send you off in a good mindset. So we're going to discuss self-criticism, discuss and explore vulnerability, discuss self-compassion versus self-esteem, and explore self-compassion and what that means. So we're going to start with self-criticism. So self-criticism can happen in anyone. Yeah, I love this picture. So we know from studies and from research that self-criticism can happen in specific populations, like children who are exposed to abuse growing up, but it's also super common in professionals, right? We've worked hard to get where we are, and a lot of times we get to where we are by being very hard on ourselves. So professionals are at really high risk for self-criticism, and that can be for a few reasons. It can be because of these high expectations put on ourselves from family members starting from a young age. I know a lot of people that I talk to say their parents wanted them to be perfect, and they had to get straight A's. And after you develop that, you start putting those pressures on yourself, which I know a lot of us experience. So we create these really high expectations for ourselves. We don't meet those expectations. When that doesn't happen, it is devastating, right? Have you guys ever not met an expectation? Like, who failed the first anatomy exam? Like, everyone. So that's devastating. I mean, I remember walking through the halls when it was just my class as a first year. People were in their study rooms crying because they've never failed before, and they failed the very first thing in medical school. So it's absolutely devastating when it happens. And on the other side of things, when we do reach a goal that we've made for ourselves, it's kind of just on to the next thing. We don't take time to celebrate those wins, and it can be really hard to feel accomplished because you've already set yourself up of, this is what I'm going to do, it's my expectation. So when you meet it, you don't take time to celebrate. And I know I talked with a lot of my friends when we graduated from medical school, and everyone was super excited because we were the first graduating class, and I really wasn't excited. I wasn't very proud of myself. I was like, oh, well, I'm done. This is what I expected to do, so let's go residency, let's keep moving. So that's something we have to be really careful of, to take time to celebrate our wins. And that can be as small as finishing reading a chapter in a book. That's not necessarily small sometimes, but it can be as small as that or as big as, like I said, graduating. So that's really important. I can tell you that preparing for this, I had a lot of self-criticism. Why am I a resident talking to you guys when you guys have had Dr. Frick? She lectured me in medical school. You guys had Dr. Starziak, who was one of my mentors for OMM. So you guys have had these great people talk to you. I'm like, why am I talking to you? What do I know? I'm only like 4 or 5, whatever, how many years ahead of education. So what am I doing here? You guys have had a really great opportunity to learn from those people, and like I said, I just want to send you off on a good note today. So when we look at self-criticism, there's kind of this weird thing that happens. I don't know if it happens with everyone, but most of the people I've talked to have said that this happens with them. Sometimes when we initially start criticizing ourselves, it can feel kind of good, like oddly good, because you start thinking these thoughts about yourself and you go into like a little shame spiral and you get down and then you wrap yourself in a little shame cocoon, and you tell your friends how terrible you are. You tell your boyfriend or your husband or your wife, like, oh, I'm the worst person ever. I did this. I made this stupid mistake and I'm a terrible person. I'm never going to succeed. This was horrible. And when you do that, you get all of this attention from who you're talking to, and they say, oh, no, you're the best. Don't think that way. You're the greatest. And that can feel good to hear that, right? A lot of times we reject it, but it can feel good to get that attention when we're in such a down space. But it's important to recognize that attention leaves pretty quickly. Someone's not going to stay around for the whole night or the whole day or the whole week telling you how great you are. So you get into this really down place, and you're the one who has to dig yourself out. And I can tell you that the recovery is a lot harder than the fall into that shame. So talking about some of the dangers of self-criticism, when we criticize ourselves so intensely, we become unable to accurately assess ourselves. So we get this picture of, I'm terrible, I'm the worst, when we all know that's not true, right? So we're not able to focus in on those things that we actually can improve on because we're just maximizing the thought that we're bad all over the place and that we need to work on everything. This can lead to a decrease in actually achieving the goals that you want to achieve. It can eventually lead to anxiety, depression, lack of motivation, because you think you're so bad at everything. Why am I going to even bother trying? Because I'm just going to do a terrible job. And this, as you guys know, can lead to burnout and unfortunately to suicide a lot of the times. So the motivation for this talk came from a book. I was talking with Maria about this actually. Brene Brown, Daring Greatly. Has anyone ever heard of that? Yeah, it's an awesome book. I recommend it very highly for everyone to read. So I worked on this talk by reading that book, and then I worked with a group from McLean University. They work really closely with Harvard Medical School, and they're one of their psychiatric affiliates. And they're a really wonderful group that talks about vulnerability and self-compassion. So I worked with them. The book, Daring Greatly, begins with this quote. This quote is actually from Theodore Roosevelt, who was one of my favorite presidents. And he gave this talk in Paris in 1910. So the quote says, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly." So I think this quote is just really beautiful. Struggle is not a new idea. I'm sure you guys can imagine that struggle is something that we've shared across demographics, across generations, but it's been the theme for so long to struggle in silence and to just accept it. And like we've talked about over the past 5 to 10 years, the medical field has just stopped accepting that. And that's why we're talking so much about wellness and burnout. And we're just not accepting the fact that you guys have to struggle in silence anymore. So I think sometimes it feels like we're over talking about it, but at least we're doing something finally about it. Because when we struggle in silence, that leads to unhappiness, it leads to burnout, and again, it leads to suicide. And in order to talk about these things, we have to have vulnerability, because it can be really scary to talk about these thoughts that we have, especially with people who we aren't super close with. So people who may just be our colleagues or our peers, and people that we have a work relationship with, but not necessarily a personal connection with. We want to hide away from these thoughts. We don't want other people to know how inadequate we feel, especially as a physician, right? Because we're expected to be in this position of power where we're leading the team, right? People are coming to us with all of their fears and their criticisms. So how can we have those as well? So I want to talk about vulnerability. Vulnerability is not knowing success or failure. It's understanding that both are necessary. It's being all in something. A quote from this book, again, Daring Greatly, says, "If we spend our lives waiting until we are perfect or until we are bulletproof before we walk into the arena, we ultimately sacrifice relationships and opportunities that may not be recoverable. We squander our precious time, and we turn our backs on our gifts, those unique contributions that only we can make." So obviously it sounds amazing to be like perfect or bulletproof, right? If we're the person that anyone can call and we can nail a central line every time, if we can catch a stroke like minutes into it happening every time and be the best there is, if we can pour our empathy into every single patient, that sounds amazing. It sounds alluring, but it doesn't exist, right? That's never going to happen. And I underline the text, those unique contributions that only we can make, because I wanted you guys to think about that. And think about the last time that you actually thought about the unique contributions that only you can make, because we don't do that a lot. Think about the time where you guys had to do your applications for medical school, or if you've applied to residency when you're writing your personal statement. You guys have unique contributions, each and every one of you, and that's why you're here. It's so hard to get into medical school, especially these days. It's really challenging, and you wouldn't get in if you didn't have something really special about you and that only you could provide. So it's really important that we protect ourselves in order to help other people. You guys all know that we have a physicians shortage here in the United States and across the entire world. So it's really important to protect ourselves so that we can help protect others. So if I asked any of you guys to give me a synonym for vulnerability, does anyone want to shout something out? I can tell you what I would think. Good, that's an amazing one. Normally I hear the opposite. So normally I hear that people say vulnerability is a huge weakness. So I'm super happy that you said that, because I want everyone to say that. So vulnerability is not a good or a bad thing. Vulnerability is actually just a feeling. If we believe that vulnerability is a weakness, we're saying that feeling is a weakness. And as a psychiatrist, that makes me super sad. So we shy away from vulnerability because sometimes it's associated with shame, with sadness, with disappointment, things we don't want to talk to other people about, especially the people we work with. But I want you guys to think of a time you've been vulnerable. And for me, some of the times that I thought about were some of the most significant in my lives. One thing I thought about is, have you guys ever been the first person to say I love you to like your boyfriend or girlfriend? It's like a super terrifying thing. That's the worst feeling ever, and your like face gets hot and you get really sweaty and uncomfortable. But when you finally say it and someone says it back to you, it's an amazing feeling. So vulnerability can be really awesome and amazing. And I wanted to talk about courage too. Brene Brown talks about courage and bravery a lot. Does anyone know like the Latin meaning for courage? You should know like C-O-R. Yeah, heart. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, hey. So courage in Latin means speaking from the heart. And we find bravery more to be going up against a difficult task. So courage, I think it's really sad that courage in our culture has to be associated with bravery, because that means speaking from the heart is something that's really difficult and hard and scary to come up against. So I think that's something where we have a really big opportunity to change that. And I think something that's important to notice is we ask our patients to be vulnerable all day long. Especially in my profession, I'm having people tell me, I'm just meeting them for like the first 10 minutes, and then they're telling me about a time when they were physically abused or sexually abused. And that's huge, right? If I was just having a conversation with a peer, I would never have that. And so I think it's really important to recognize that we're expecting this vulnerability out of others and out of our patients, but sometimes we can't deliver that. So I think it's really important to look at that. And I want to look at how we can actually start changing our medical culture of being the strong ones in charge that never make mistakes to creating a culture of vulnerability. You ultimately are sharing your struggles and fears, sharing times that you made mistakes or times that maybe things didn't go as you expected them to go. I wanted to ask a question, and I hope I'm wrong about the answer, but how many of you guys have had an attending say to you that they made a mistake? That's awesome. Even seeing those 4 or 5 people, that's amazing that you've heard that. How many of you guys have heard an attending blame something on a team member, like a nurse or a tech? Yeah, a lot more, right? So that culture we're creating of blaming other people, of not owning up to our mistakes, of displacing our fears and our insecurities onto others can be a really dangerous thing. It can be dangerous for ourselves because we start to get very spiteful and hateful sometimes, and it can be really dangerous for breaking down a team and cohesion there. So I think something that's really important, and I'll talk about a little later, but having a situation where something goes wrong, it doesn't go as expected, I think it's really important to admit to your team, like, hey, I made a mistake, this isn't what I should have done, and owning up to that. And I'll talk a little bit about vulnerability and when it's appropriate, but I hope that's something you guys will start to see more in your attending physicians as you come up in school and in residency, because I'm hoping that the culture is starting to shift that way. So something that's important when looking at vulnerability is a lot of times we compare our insides to other people's outsides. So we can be in a situation where we're super nervous and we're freaking out, and on the inside we're panicking, but we look around and everyone else is like stone-faced, they look cool, calm, collected, right? And you probably on the outside look a little bit like that too. You're probably sweating a little bit more. But it's really important that we don't compare ourselves and what we're feeling on the inside to someone's outside, right? Because how many times can you hide what you're feeling and throw a smile on or start making jokes and laughing? So it's really important not to do that. We need to stop assuming that everyone else is great and they're cool and you're the only one struggling, because that's going to limit your ability to be vulnerable. If you constantly feel like you're the worst one in the group and just assume that everyone's doing great, you're not going to want to open up to them. I wouldn't want to open up to them. Not at all. So I think something that's important to talk about if we're talking about vulnerability is how do you respond to other people when they're being vulnerable? When you do this, when someone comes up to you and says like, oh, I really messed up, I ordered potassium for someone who was already hyperkalemic. So you need to remember being in someone else's shoes. If you guys are working with pre-med students, let's say, remember how scared you were in that situation, and try and normalize that. And you can always say something like, you know, it's okay to have a bad day. It's normal sometimes to make screw-ups and to slide backwards, but don't let it keep you down. It's good to model humility and not knowing the answer to everything, but what you don't want to do when someone's vulnerable with you is overgeneralize. So you don't want to say things like, oh, you're so good, it doesn't matter that you made that mistake because you're great, so don't even worry about it. That feels like something to do just because you want to lift someone's self-esteem, but that's actually really counterproductive because it's either making them ignore the problem that happened, or it's just making them feel worse because you're just kind of glossing over what they did and not letting them admit that they did something wrong. So vulnerability, something that's really important about it, it's not oversharing and it's not purging. So I don't want you guys to go out and tell everyone like every single thing you ever did wrong and how terrible you are and like that one time that you accidentally tripped your patient or something. Like, don't go out and tell everyone that. I think vulnerability has a place among your peers, but I'd be careful when you're being vulnerable with someone that's above you in a position of power, especially as medical students and upcoming residents, because that can be really scary, and that can be some disclosure that maybe you shouldn't be making. So I would always start with your peers and your colleagues, and you can start with people below you in your level of training too, because I would never want someone to disclose something to like the program director of a program or something, and then not get a position because of what they shared. So it's really important to share among your peers and people who you're equal with. And vulnerability is a trust-building process, right? You're not going to start out by telling something like someone the worst thing you've ever done. You don't bare your souls the first time you've ever met someone. So I'm going to share a little bit about some self-criticism that I've had, and then I'll ask you guys to do the same. So One of my biggest self-critical moments back in medical school was I was a third year just going out into rotations. My first rotation was internal medicine at St. Vincent. Has anyone done that? The Ames team? Yeah, that's a terrifying place to be, especially as like your first rotation ever. That's really scary. I was like, I want to start with the hardest thing so that everything's downhill from there and it's smooth sailing. Which was a terrible idea for me. So I started out on Ames, and I got a couple of patients. I really just worked with my resident, but my resident didn't want to work with medical students, so I really just worked by myself. And then we rolled around to the second week, and we had worked like 90 hours, and I wasn't used to working that much. I was very tired. And my attending says, okay, he looked at my badge. He's like, student Dr. Hope. And I was like, it's Hop. Yeah, cool. He was like, okay, well, we'll go see your patient and you can present to me. And you guys know you don't get a lot of FaceTime with attendings usually, especially on residency services. So I was like, yeah, it's my time to shine. I'm going to get such a good review, and I'm going to get honors in this. So he took me to see my patient. And it was, I think she was in her 50s, African-American female with diabetes, high cholesterol. She had like bilateral amputations. And so we went in to see her, and she was there for rhabdomyolysis. And so I do my presentation, and he's just silent, and I'm like, okay, it must be good because he's not interrupting me. And then he said, okay, so what do you think is the cause of this? And I was like, oh, well, she has rhabdomyolysis. And he's like, okay, so what, why? Why does she have rhabdomyolysis? I was like, oh, probably because she was, she was found down because she had fallen out of her wheelchair. And he's like, well, how long was she down for? And I was like, oh, about 2 hours. And he said, so you would expect everyone who goes to sleep at night to wake up with rhabdomyolysis? I was like, no, I guess not. And he was like, okay, well, what do you notice about her medicines? What in her medicines could cause this? And I was like, she's on Prozac, so maybe Prozac. He's like, and no, like, don't you remember the one medicine that has a main side effect of rhabdomyolysis? And I could tell that he thought he was throwing me like a softball, like, oh God, anyone can get this question right. But I didn't know, and my face got red, and I got very embarrassed, and he was like, okay, well, it's statins, so you really need to know that because that's something a first-year med student should know. And I was like, okay, I'm a third year, so that's great. So in that moment, I felt terrible, right? This is my first rotation. This was my time to shine. I was like, I am the dumbest person here. Like, I shouldn't even be on the team. No wonder my resident doesn't want to work with me and teach me because, like, she can't teach me. I'm unteachable. This is terrible. So it's just, you can just really get into that mindset really quickly, especially when you're in a vulnerable place of just getting out into hospitals. That was my first time ever in a hospital even. So you guys are in really scary places. And I wanted to share this because, is this the worst mistake I have made? Hell no, like not even close. But like I said, vulnerability is not about oversharing. It's not about purging. You have to build a level of trust with people, right? If I didn't have boundaries, then it would be the point where you're telling people things for just shock and awe and to get their sympathy or their pity or get their attention. That's not what vulnerability is about. It's about building that connection and learning and growing from it. So what I want you guys to do now is hopefully exhibit a bit of courage. I want you guys to turn to some of the people next to you and just share with each other a story about self-criticism that you've had, something where you fell into your little shame cocoon and felt really terrible. And if you're sitting next to like a dean or like one of your teachers, like just politely scooch away. But yeah, go ahead and do that, and then we'll go from there. All right. I hate to interrupt you guys, but I want to be mindful of your time. So I hope you guys all got a chance to share some of your stories of self-criticism. And next one I want to do, I hope it works. Is it coming up there? Get help it. Open poll in web browser. Let's see if this works. Have you guys used this before? Just poll everywhere. Oh, that's definitely not going to work. Okay, well, what I wanted you guys to do was to think about some of the self-critical thoughts that you've had and to share those. And I think what you see a lot is that a lot of people feel the same things. And you might have heard that when you were sharing with each other. But I wanted to show, I've done parts of this talk with residents and with attendings also, and I want to show you some of their responses. So this is for residents. I'm never going to get it right. I'm not prepared enough to practice on my own. You're a fraud. Why can't I remember this? Did I even study antibiotics? And then for attendings, my favorite one was, I can't even figure out how to use this pole. Which is amazing. No wonder I didn't get into anesthesia. So I just want to really emphasize that self-critical thoughts don't go away. Whether you're a resident or attending, they're here to stay. I thought this quote was very fitting. One of the tragic ironies of modern life is that so many people feel isolated from each other by the very feelings they have in common, including a fear of failure and a sense of not being enough. I think that's really emphasized by seeing the same responses from residents and attendings. A really common one that I hear is that I'm a fraud, or I'm a phony, or I don't belong here. A lot of people feel this like imposter syndrome almost of like, why am I a doctor? Like, I don't know what I'm doing. So I think it's important just to recognize that people are feeling the same way as you, even though, like I said, don't compare your insides to outsides. People might look confident. I know I worked with Savannah and Allison. Like, I might have looked confident some of the time, but I probably wasn't, or I might have been insecure about things. So I think Dr. Frick actually talked about this in one of her talks. You want to look at your mindset, and when starting to look at self-compassion, we have to shift from a fixed mindset, which in this specific case is sometimes shame, and the feeling that I am bad, so that when you do something bad, it's because I inherently am a bad person, and everything I do is bad. And so we want to shift that fixed mindset to a growth mindset, and this is more of the feeling of guilt, and that feeling is like, I did something bad, and now I need to fix it, but I'm not a bad person because I did something bad. That doesn't define who I am. So what is self-compassion? Has anyone heard of self-compassion before? Yeah, awesome. It's historically a Buddhist principle. That's where it really started, but it started to come over to like North America and South America in the 70s and 80s. I like to think of this as self-compassion as how a friend would treat you, and not just a friend, but like your best friend, like the one that's really going to tell you that your dress is ugly, like the person that'll be real with you, but still wants you to succeed and be a good person. So self-compassion can include three main components. The first is self-kindness. This is being kind and understanding towards oneself in instances of pain or failure, rather than being harshly self-critical. It also includes common humanity. This is perceiving your experiences as part of the larger human experience, rather than seeing them as separate and isolating. And finally, mindfulness, which I know you guys had a talk about earlier today too. This is having these painful thoughts and feelings in a balanced awareness rather than over-identifying them. So balancing those negative thoughts and those thoughts of suffering and failure with some of the positive thoughts as well. And I want to really distinguish self-esteem versus self-compassion, because I think it's a really important difference. So self-esteem looks at three different things. It evaluates your personal performance. It involves a comparison of yourself to some standards and perceived importance. Self-esteem also really involves looking into others' evaluations of yourself. So how much do others like me? How do they approve of me? And self-esteem is very overgeneralized sometimes. The premise relies on extremes like wonderful or great or the best ever or amazing, and builds you up to like feel special and like you're a wonderful, unique snowflake that never does anything wrong. And that can be really dangerous, right? Because then we can develop almost some narcissism and not understand where our weaknesses are and what we need to improve on. Self-compassion's premise is kindness towards yourself and towards others, and it works on accepting you just as you are, and knowing that humanity is ever-changing and that you will change along with it. So looking at self-compassion, I think it's really normal to initially have some skepticism when you're looking at self-compassion. like myself, and I'm sure many of you, we've spent our entire lives not feeling good enough, not living up to these astronomical expectations that you've set for yourself. But after years of doing this, when I started utilizing mindfulness and self-compassion, I can say truthfully that my life is much better balanced. I start really utilizing self-compassion about 6 months ago into residency, after I was having a lot of struggles with certain attendings and really feeling down on myself. And my life completely changed. Not only did I change on the inside with how I felt about myself, but others would say like, oh, you just seem more confident. You just seem more at peace with what's going on and knowing what you can change and not change. And honestly, I've become a much better physician because of this, and I think I've become a much better leader, and I think I've become a much better educator as well. Now, that's not to say that I don't deal with self-criticism, because I can definitely tell you that I still do. All of my colleagues can attest to that. My boyfriend can attest to that. Self-compassion isn't just ignoring what's wrong and like going to your happy place on the beach with like a pina colada. It's looking at a situation with a realistic lens and being kind to yourself in that situation. And when you start developing this self-compassion and this mindfulness, it will lead to emotional resilience. Emotional resilience is something that really helps to combat burnout. Emotional resilience is a 3-step mantra. The first is recognizing that you're in a moment of suffering, that things aren't good, this feels terrible, things are not okay. The second is to remember that suffering is a part of living and none of us can avoid this. And the third is thinking, may I be kind to myself, or repeat a self-made mantra, like I'm still learning, I know that I'm capable of changing, I know I'm capable of doing better. This isn't just saying I'm great and ignoring the situation, acting like it never happened. It's treating yourself like that best friend and treating yourself kindly. One of my mantras, I'm not going to tell you what it is because you all can make your own. And again, I had another poll where I wanted you guys to think of a self-compassionate statement. So I'll just ask you guys to do it for yourselves for about 15 seconds. So try thinking of something that you could say to yourself in that moment of suffering that you were having earlier when you were having those self-critical thoughts. What's something that you could have thought to yourself instead? So I hope you guys are able to find something and something that you can say to yourself that really exhibits kindness toward yourself, but again with that realistic lens, not just glossing over things and saying like, oh, you know, I'll never make a mistake again, right? But being really kind to yourself and treating yourself well. And I want to talk about the impact this has. I know I talked about some of the impacts in my own life. It has a huge impact on yourself, how you feel about yourself, and how you really work in relationships, not only your personal relationships, but with work colleagues, relationships with other learners, especially when you guys are working with your younger peers, or when you become a resident when you're working with medical students. It can have a really huge impact on team members as well. I can tell you when I went up to one of my nurses that I work with and I told her that I made a mistake, she's like, I've never heard a doctor say that. So it can be really humbling for yourself and can really make your team members trust you and embrace you a lot more. And then once you practice this for a while, it can hopefully have an impact on people above you and around you. And hopefully that'll make a culture change. And something that's important is when you're able to do this and when you're able to show yourself compassion, it's important to think about why did this work? Why do I feel okay instead of feeling terrible and taking a week to feel just really bad about myself? So it's important to recognize that and to pat yourself on the back when you do it, because it's really hard to change a mindset. It's really hard to break habits. So I hope that you guys ended this day a little bit better and a little bit more well. And thank you so much for having me. It's very honored. you all can leave now. Or if you have questions, I'll hang around. Yeah.
Does anyone have any?
You can come up to me after, too. Or if you want to go into psychiatry.
Okay, so if we still have any physicians here, I just wanted to say to make sure that you check in with the registration desk to make sure that you've filled out everything and signed everything for CME credit. Even if you did not register early, we actually have some extra parking passes, so please feel free to go to the registration desk and receive one on a first-come, first-served basis. Please be on the lookout for an email with a post-conference survey. We actually do utilize the feedback for the future firm conferences. And also be sure to follow us on social media to see what firm is up to in the interim until the 2020 conference. Do not forget to join us at Books and Brews on Mass Ave for continued conversation and a post-conference celebration. And then thank you again for coming to today's conference. We look forward to seeing you in 2020, and we hope you feel inspired and reminded why you chose to pursue this challenging yet undeniably rewarding career. So thank you everyone so much for coming and sticking around.
No, I'm on outpatient. But you're with, are you on crisis this week or what?
No, I've just been like the inpatient this week, so I think crisis is...
Cool, so you're with
Yeah, I'm in a Navy Cup event. We're doing Austin's birthday.